thank you for the WFA for the invite. Thank you all for coming along. It's, as I always say, it's an enormous pleasure to talk to WFA members, and always slightly scary as well, because I know the immense amount of knowledge that's out there. So as Simon said, today I'm talking about the company British Instructional Films, and it's mainly about their silent productions all the way through the 20s, but there was one that went into the 1930s, which you'll see kind of as part of the epilogue of the talk. So just to dive straight in, let's get the kind of context there. British Instructional Films is founded in 1919 in an old Nissen hut that he'd bought and plonked down in Elstree by Harry Bruce Wolfe. Bruce Wolfe was a pre-war impresario in the theatre who had started to move towards film. He had a home front staff job in the war. He joined the army, and it was really whilst in the army and looking at the way film was being used, and that he got some of the ideas about film as an instructional tool, and also I think as an advertising tool for companies. So he sets this company up, and it's, for its first few years, what it's making are these incredible science documentaries. It's Secrets of Nature series, using remarkably advanced techniques, where they followed things like the evolution of an embryo in an egg. And you can see so important of these films are these films that British Film Institute a few years back digitized them all and got them out onto DVD. So that was really the way the company started. That was its reputation. Now, interestingly, he moved sort of sideways then from these Secrets of Nature and a few travelogue kind of films into the history of the war. And things kick off in 1921 with the Battle of Jutland. I mean, if you're going to start with a film, you've got to give him 10 out of 10 for ambition, haven't you? I know we'll do Jutland, and as you can see there, it was actually the narrative came out of notes supplied by Sir George Aston, the major military historian and general, and he went through all of the official documentation to make an accompanying lecture. So you can see, if we're also thinking about the history of cinema here, these films are right at the cusp, that intersection of what had been the late Victorian and Edwardian lantern slide, where so there'd be a slideshow and there'd be a lecturer talking you through the story, in much the same way, of course, as people like Herbert Ponting had done, both with these photographs and the film stock that he'd taken with Scott, and that Frank Hurley, was doing with his stuff from the South Georgia, what becomes the Shackleton expedition, where he ends up back on South Georgia. So it's sitting at, I say, that kind of intersection of the development of film. Now, this one, you'll be unsurprised to know, didn't contain any live action, but instead it was in many ways, the world's first great Wallace and Gromit. It was freeze frame animation with models on an 8-foot square of the North Sea. And apparently, according to all the documentation, the press reports, it took, I think it was 40,000 separate tiny movements of each of these little model ships to do the evolutions of the Battle of Jutland. Unfortunately, here we go. There's the production team at work. Unfortunately, not a frame of this film survives anywhere. It tells you something, I think, really about the way film is regarded in its still relatively early days as a fairly transient, lower class piece of entertainment. It won't last. It doesn't have too much value, and of course being made on nitrate stock, which degrades and or blows up very quickly. It meant that the combination of the technological problems of conserving with the snobbery about film meant that this film has disappeared completely. But interestingly, you know, if we're going to think about that year 1921, it's in the run-up to the Washington Naval Disarmament Conference, and what I find absolutely fascinating, that spring of 22, when British films find it very, very hard to penetrate the American market because they can't get distributors, you know, they can't get handlers that want to put them out around the cinemas. All of a sudden, Jutland is being shown around the state, and it is being shown in Washington. Now, I went through the Admiralty papers, I went through the Foreign Office papers, and couldn't find the smoking gun that I was looking for. But it wouldn't surprise me if someone somewhere pulled strings to make sure that this film was distributed in the USA in that highly sensitive time as the Naval Disarmament Conference opens up in Washington. And also, you know, crucially, in 1921, a German film director working exactly the similar manner of freeze frame produces a film called the Skaggarak, you know, as the Germans called it, and they have their own film version of Jutland. And as we know, you know, as a battle, its outcome is fiercely contested between the two protagonists. And so I think we can see Jutland as part of the Battle of Jutland as part of an ongoing debate, an ongoing fight about the meaning of the history, you know, what had actually happened and who has the right to tell it and who has the authentic history. But it's hard to judge much more. You can only do it from press reviews and such like, because the stock isn't there. But it's remarkably successful, considering the kind of film it is, you know, which is tiny movements of tiny models, and with some intertitles, but for bigger cinemas, there would have been the notes, you know, the script read out, but which, you know, you might have thought wouldn't be to every film goer's cup of tea, but it works very, very well. Buoyed by this, Wolfe makes Armageddon, which is about the advance of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force under Allenby. And what he does there is largely constructed out of newsreel images, the official newsreel, and the material that was taken of the army advancing, which was spliced together. Again, there's not a frame extant of this. However, and what we do know from reviews and from some of the stills is in the studio, they mocked up the fall of Jerusalem, the opening of the city's main gates, where you know, people pouring out to greet the advancing British and imperial troops. And there was some new footage taken of the cavalry doing its charging around. But say, again, very hard to get a real sense of it, given what's left. But interestingly now, you know, Wolfe playing around with this idea of live action reconstruction, you know, that we will actually recreate the events, and of course, as we now know, but was unclear at the time, something like the Battle of the Somme film, you know, with its reconstructed assault, the guys running out of the trenches, we're seeing that this same theme, this idea that provided you do things according to the strict historical record, and of course the British historical record is the accurate one, provided you do it like that, then you can reconstruct the past as it was, you can recreate reality, and you can pass it off as a sort of new version of the historical record. And that's undoubtedly how it's seen, you know, as telling the history of the war, the history of the glories of the British Empire in the First World War, in the Great War. And all of this, by the early 20s, is becoming more and more politically laden and fraught, largely because Hollywood is already sticking its oar into the war history and is making its own version. And nothing puts the noses out of joint more of the British Empire than the idea that the Yanks are stealing their war from them from underneath their noses. So this is all part of a kind of wider cinematic game, really, for the dominance of the image of the war. Again, does very, very well in the box office, and encourages the next move, which is the wonder that is Zeebrugge, directed by A.W. Bramble, with Wolf producing. Now, I'll come back to Zeebrugge in a moment, because what I'll do is I'll just finish off the canon of films that we're talking about, because from here on in, we've got material to talk about. You know, that there's enough of the original for us to discuss in more detail. It goes on after the even bigger box office success to the single biggest box office success they have it within the British Empire and across the world, which is Ypres of 1925. So that one breaks records in quite a few cinemas in Britain and indeed in the British Empire. So, you know, if we take it that what we're looking at in commercial cinema, you know, is a capitalist product, it's there to make money, it's there to put bums on seats, and so the measure of the success of these films, you can take the box office as a good yardstick, and this one is phenomenally successful given the investment that's made in it. Then comes their second greatest box office hit. The follow-up is Mons, which is also a remarkable film, and you know, we can start to go into the trends of the content. And then the last of the silent films is the battles of Coronel and Falkland Islands in 1927. Now that it undoubtedly artistically, you know, as a piece of cinematic art, is the finest of the films. It does well at the box office, but not as well as the other two, and I think there are reasons for that, which is to do with the timing of release as well, and I'll go into that as we go along. So there you've got the set, and the kind of epilogue I will say for the epilogue, the very final film, which ends up being a sound production. So if we think about Zeebrugge, and there you have the guys, you know, charging up onto the mole, onto the quayside at Zeebrugge. What is this film like? Well, I think what's very interesting, again, is the way it walks the tightrope between being a kind of almost like a lecture format and gives you the thrill of real live action, you know, of watching soldiers go into action in this grand scale raid. So that kind of lecture element you get in shots like this, I feel, you know, where you get quite a few that are establishing shots which show you the map. You get these bird's eye view, so you get the literal Olympian detachment, you know, that you are being invited almost like you are walking around a museum exhibit to understand the event with the detached eye of the historian, with the detached eye of the student in the museum, trying to make sense of the past. And I think that's what these kind of effects do. But they sit in a very sort of happy tension with the sheer emotional appeal. So you do get thrills and gallantry here. You know, you see the the semaphore flags, spelling out St. George for England, and give the dragon's tail, a damn good twist. That's all there. They splice in some of the original footage of things like the Vindictive, going off of men in training camps, preparing for the expedition, and when the Vindictive comes back as well, when she came home, it's got all her battle damage. That newsreel footage was put in. And then in the new action stuff, it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, it is really exciting stuff. I say, men charge up gangplanks, they slide down ladders, they zoom down ropes. There's great exchanges of fire with the Germans, and so here we see the war as boys' own adventure, as thrill, and it's everything. It's maintaining everything that was said about the raid during the war. As we all know, that the Zeebrugge raid is far more important in its own way as a propaganda boost, a very frightening moment in the war when the German spring offensives, are at full tilt. So to have this sense of that the British, can kick back even when their backs are against the wall, was important in 1918, and that legacy went with it, and it's really very well shown in the film. And also in the film, what they really do, and it's going to become a hallmark of the next few films for British instructional films, is that the narrative is constructed around Victoria Cross winning incidents. So each kind of chapter of the film builds up to the next VC that's going to be won, or the next great gallantry medal, that's going to be won, and that provides it with its human interest. That engages the emotions of the audience. But I said it's sort of fascinating that it kind of flicks between at times. Then the detached museum gaze, and when you think that really has become a trope of war films, hasn't it? That it might wear some of its historical authenticity at certain parts in the film through things like maps, and aerial views, and then you kind of go into the to the stuff that really engages the emotions and the heart as much as the head. Now, as this film is released, I think what helps make it so incredibly good value at the box office is that it is being mutually supported by the Wembley Empire exhibition, because the great event at the Wembley Empire exhibition in the British government pavilion is the Zeebrugge display, which, from what I can work out, was a bit like a souped up version of Michael Benting's Potty Time. That insofar as there are lots and lots of little explosions, it's got model boats that zoom around on this pond that they built. There are fireworks that go off around it. Now, this packs the British government pavilion. I think it's 3 times a day they are showing the raid on Zeebrugge. And so of course, British instructional films aren't complaining. People are going to that they're seeing the representation at Wembley, and then they want to see the film. So I say that they're mutually supporting each other. And again, I think what's really, really interesting here, just as a little aside, you think of all of the aspects of the war at sea that could have been part of the British government's presentation at Wembley, and they don't choose Jutland. They make Zeebrugge the core of it, and I think it is because of that fact. It's a better story. It comes over better to a non-specialist audience. You can engage hearts and minds more easily, and you don't have a controversy. Whether the raid's successful or not, they can avoid that bit. You don't have the obvious controversy about the success or outcome of battle that they do with Jutland. So it's sort of interesting that the government takes that position. So there's Zeebrugge, which rumbles on, as a film, keeps coming and going from the cinema, and I think that the reopening, Wembley has a slight pause, it closes for a bit, and then it reopens as an exhibition, and again the film comes out alongside that. So they've made a huge amount of money now. They've filmed in tanks at they built extra tanks at Elstree for Zeebrugge, and Wolf and British Instructional Films have worked out that the war sells. Now, when you think, if you've read your kind of literary scholarship about the war, there's that big cliche, isn't there, that there's a 10-year silence gap, until the big memoirs and the big novels start to come out from around about 1928, and then you get Goodbye to All That and everything else coming out. Well, you see that it's a complete nonsense, that vision, isn't it? That only works if you're going to use high literature as your yardstick of the footprint of the war. The war is constantly being retold throughout the 1920s, and one of the ways in which it is being most potently retold is in this extremely popular sphere, and so of popular entertainments, of mass entertainment, and pretty much none of it is based on the idea that it was all a waste of time and everyone is completely disillusioned. They're never, as I'll stress in a moment, they're never avoiding the bloodiness of the war, but it's what the war means, and it's the gallantry of what men did that's all important. So the war makes money. It is not an anathema subject at all. It is not something that you only consider in Armistice Week. Now, flush with the success of this, we get Captain Walter Somers enters this a sort of production side. Now, Walter Somers comes from a theatrical family. As a young man, he'd followed his parents into the theatre. He serves in the 8th East Surreys in the war, so he's there with R.C. Sheriff. Somers really, from what we can see from the papers that he left behind and is still extant, really quite enjoyed his war. He quite enjoyed zooming around no man's land in the middle of the night as well. He went on quite a few raids. He obviously had an all right time, So what's fascinating is he comes back after the war. When he's demobilized, he goes into the film industry. He kind of picks up his career, and he's moved slightly sideways. He's thinking about theatre before the war, but he's seen film, and he goes into film direction, and he starts directing at BIF on sort of pure commercial numbers, as it were, fiction films. And then Wolf says, come in, and you, as a veteran of the Ypres salient, you make our next project. You work on Ypres. So here we get a war veteran, reconstructing in some ways parts of his own personal experiences on screen. That's what we're going to. He's going to bring that authenticity to it, and sometimes you'll see, particularly, if you're looking at books in the 1960s, 1970s about British instructional films, you see quite a snooty attitude to them. All these heroics, all this daring do and running around. What kind of home front inspired nonsense it is. Well, no, hang on. We've got to rewind there a bit, haven't we? I say, when you've got so many veterans involved, say Bruce Wolf might have not done much service on the Western Front, but certainly knows the army, and Somers has done a lot of service on the Western Front and knows what he's talking about. So he is bringing that personal testimony and authenticity with him. So what does he do? Well, Ypres is like Zeebrugge, but on a much bigger scale, is essentially one breathless VC moment after another. The majority of the film, it's got an interesting imbalance in terms of its chronology and in its weighting. The vast majority of the film is weighted towards 1914 and 1915, with a slightly shorter segment on Messines and Third Ypres. And I think, you know, we can all guess the reasons there. It's a little bit, you know, you can do good stuff about Passchendaele, but it's a little bit harder to spin the narrative than it is about 14 and 15, because 14 and 15 are also about defending. And as we know, the British like to think of themselves, they're entering the war as a war of defence. You know, backs against the wall kind of stuff is also deeply ingrained in the national psyche, being the minority against the overwhelming might, you know, of the nasty oppressor. That plays to British cultures, and I think, you know, Summers is well attuned to that and works with that. So say the kind of structure of the film isn't even at all, by very deliberate design. You can see most of this now. You know, you can buy it on DVD. It's not quite the full theatrical cut, but it's so damn close, you know, that you don't need to worry that you're missing much in the version that's on DVD. So what does Summers give us? Well, for a start, here we are on Salisbury Plain with Fitzclarence organising the counterattack at Gellerville. And it would show you, you know, the reputation that British instructional films have now got, that they enter into really easy negotiations with the War Office in order to access Salisbury Plain, and the War Office put battalions at their disposal to run around and be the extras. So the War Office see this as also a recruitment aid, you know, and they obviously don't see that what might be thought of, you know, the carve-ups of the Western Front as a great problem for recruitment. So there are lots and lots of soldiers here, you know, playing other soldiers. Oh, and excuse my typo there. Destinies is what I meant to have written. So unlike Wilfred Owen's poetry, you know, where there's that idea of men being the powerless playthings of the kind of capricious gods of war that fling them around as toys, here in Ypres, men shape their own destinies. They take decisions on the battlefield that change the course of human history. So Fitzclarence, you know, ordering his men up, pointing out, you can see, like, to his subordinate officer, here's the situation, get your guys up there, plug the gap, stop the onslaught. So agency is there, you know, and you get that sort of whispers, or more than whispers, you get that call of wartime poetry. You know, it strikes me there as the men run into the counter-attack. We've got William Noel Hodgson, haven't we? And when the summons in our ears were shrill, unshaken in our trust we rose, and then flung but a backward glance, and carefree still went strongly forth to do the work of men. So, you know, what some might think of as the discredited war poetry is still there in the 20s and kind of being relived in a new way and given new power by the moving image. Men endure and overcome. So here are the Canadian soldiers going up the Bellevue Spur, you know, as part of the assault on Passchendaele. So there is agony, there is the need to endure, but these men meet that challenge. And they do so, like Captain Scott in his diary. Remember, Scott's diary, Scott's words permeate this Edwardian and Georgian society, and it's still there after the war. So as he says, in one of his last diary entries, we took risks. We knew we took them. We do not blame others. We took the risk. We took our part. We accept what fate chucks at us. So there are Canadian soldiers just fought themselves up onto a remarkably dry Passchendaele Ridge and holding it against German counterattack. Now, in all of this, you see the hideous realities of war as well. So this is the gas attack in 1915. So again, for some of the cheap shots that are put against it, it's all jolly hockey sticks, boys' own adventure type stuff. Well, no, not really, because they don't deny the agonies of war. In all of these films, the corpses pile up. There are lots and lots of dead men. Just like the corpse on the Royal Artillery Memorial, but just like that corpse on the Royal Artillery Memorial, where you might say it deviates is what you never see are bits of bodies. You never see headless cadavers. You never see arms flying off here. You see lots and lots of men being killed, and they fall and they die just as the guy did on the Somme, in the Somme film, and they die then in a way that their relatives can accept. They collapse as whole bodies. But that doesn't take away from the hideous reality of war. Here are men being gassed in the Second Battle of Ypres. There are men guttering, choking, drowning, as Wilfred Owen will have it in Dulce et Decorum. So the war's realities are there. And sitting alongside this, so I say, you can see this is a complex film. So you've got human agency, you've got people making decisions. They're not, say, flung around by the capricious gods of war or even the lunacies, of donkey generals. They take history into their own hands. We then have the hideous reality of war. Sitting alongside all that, of course, we have the wonder machines of war as well. Ypres has got quite a big bit about the tank attacks in 1917. It's also got a big scene about bringing a Zeppelin down. Again, these sort of new machines of war are given their place, and the kinds of things that will certainly keep young kids interested. And on that, here is where I think these films also act as the solvent between those who didn't see the war and those who did. We know, don't we, that this cliche that veterans never ever spoke about their experiences. And as I think I might have said before, that's a kind of, sort of element, isn't it? It's about who they're prepared to speak to. It's not about the fact that they never ever speak. It's about who they feel comfortable speaking with. You get great Uncle Frank with his pals in the old Comrades Association on late into Armistice Day afternoon, and they've all been on the sauce for quite a few hours. They never stop talking about it. It's others that they don't talk to. So this film, though, in many ways, by showing what it does, and again, this is where Summers is great, amongst these big dramatic incidents in the battles, he very deliberately takes a different direction. He'll suddenly take the pace out of it by showing you everyday scenes. That this is what happened. This is what it was like. We didn't fight every day. There were other bits going on. There were fairly normal kind of days in the trenches. And in that, of course, it answers the questions. What did you do in the war, Daddy? How did you eat in the trenches, Dad? It's up there, son. I don't need to say anymore. Look, they're showing you. We used to put a billy can on, like that. We used to put a little ration tin on. We get a little bit of charcoal, whatever we got. We had to blow it into life. And so you see what we might call the everyday domestic realities of the war in the film. How did you wash, Dad? Well, in Poppering, they had these big old vats, which they used to brew beer in. Look, it's up there. So I think these films become the surrogate language for veterans and their families, go to see them. We'll go and see this, and you don't need to ask me many more questions because it's all up there on the screen. Have a good look. And you get comic cuts as well through all of this. So there they are. They're delousing there. Look, and you can see it's pure musical. It's pure Bairns Father. Look at the size of this one. Enormous, you could make a dinner out of this. So there are also lots of little comic scenes in the films that are taking, calming down the drama a bit, showing the good humour of the Tommy, but therefore as well showing a kind of totality of life in the army. Now, as I said, it goes down incredibly well across the entire British Empire. And here is where, look, this is an advert from the Toronto Star and the or it might be the Ottawa Citizen, actually, this one. So one of the Canadian newspapers, you can see Gregory Clark, a veteran of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, a writer and journalist. His review for the Toronto Star, telling Canadians as well, go to see this picture and look at that. There's that sense of it being the solvent between the veteran and the home front. If you let your boy take you to see this picture, if you're the wife or the girlfriend or the fiance, if you let your other half take you to see this picture, be prepared to sit up till morning over the teacups and cake when you get home, because that you're going to see his war. And you will end up talking about it because this will get the conversation flowing. And I think what's also interesting here from a cinematic history point of view, and how these films make some of their impact. You can see at the bottom there, it says the Mudlarks. Now, they're a bit like the Dumbbells. They were a group of entertainers that had served in the Canadian forces in the war and have gone back, to their pre-war life. They've gone back to the stage and theatre, but they, by the 20s, are often the act before the film starts. So we can see again in the 20s, we're in this kind of hybrid world where the theatre and the cinema are only gradually carving out entirely separate spaces for themselves. So the Mudlarks would regularly entertain in Toronto. And here they did a whole shtick, before the film started, of singing trench songs, of sitting around. They had little estaminet scene where, they sat round tables. So this was all happening on the cinema stage before the film started. And of course, that gets people into the mood for the whole thing. It builds them up. In Britain, many cinemas actually put out a call to the British Legion and other veterans groups. They said, we're going to turn the foyer into a mini museum. What have you got? Now, I think in Middlesbrough, one of the cinemas in Middlesbrough puts a fairly massive model, tethers a massive model of a Zeppelin to the roof of the cinema. In Chelmsford, they get the city council to lend them their war prize. So a field gun is dragged and put outside the cinema. Another theatre makes its entrance, turns it into the entrance to a dugout. And people come through, they buy their tickets and they sit around in the foyer in a dugout until they go in. And then, the Great War songs start. So when you see, the press coverage of this, it talks about people queuing round the block to see this, and veterans coming out, with their wives, with their kids. The Marble Arch Pavilion, where it premieres in London, puts on 2 extra shows a day. It starts showing this at 10 o'clock in the morning because it's got such an audience size to get through. So they're doing 5 showings a day at its height of this film. So quite remarkable, that the impact that it has. And it's all the more important at this point because, of course, when we get to 1926 and the next big winner, Mons, 1926, what's coming out in Britain is the big parade. And oh my God, particularly what you might call the tabloid right-wing press, the Daily Mail and the Daily Express go absolutely bonkers about the big parade. Isn't the big parade appalling? Tries to show that America won the war alone. Only Americans, only doughboys, not us. We're not there. We're not counted as good enough. The fallout against Big Parade, if it was bad enough in Britain, in Australia is absolutely apoplectic, which makes Australians go out to see Ypres all the more. And I can't quite prove this, but it comes from some of the hints really in the press reactions. Of course, silent film, and we'll go into the misnomer that is silent film in a minute. But silent film, thanks to working on intertitles and having no soundtrack, because what you can do if you want is splice in your own intertitles. That's what a distributor can do. Yeah, it's much easier to do that with this kind of film production. There are some hints in the Canadian and Australian press reactions that some of the VC incidents, are given a new intertitle to make sure that you think you're seeing a local soldier's achievements, which they can get away with because this is a much more plastic medium than later film is. But say because of that, I mean, good luck to them for doing. Because of that, there is an obsession in Canada, in New Zealand, Australia that it almost outdoes the British in seeing these films, because there is no damn way, that the Americans are going to take this victory for us. So here is where film continues the war after the war, but the war after the war is who owns the memory of it, who owns the history of it. So Mons gets also lent a lot of soldiers. Quite a bit of it is actually filmed at Shorncliffe Barracks, which is near me down at Folkestone. Notices are put up in Folkestone to tell people not to panic if they see Uhlans skipping around on the hills outside Folkestone. They're all part of the film production. And yes, and the Home Office had to be informed just in case there were any very, very confused policemen as German cavalry was zooming around the lanes of deep southeast Kent. So, and again, think of the year that this is coming out. It's coming out in general strike year, a year in which Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, is trying to talk about the fundamental unity of Great Britain as a family, that it holds together and it will not fracture under these strains, and this film is playing out against that background. So you get the fights for right. So there you have the German ambassador, being told that Britain will fight for a scrap of paper. Its name is on the Treaty of London, and it will not allow it to be contemptuously thrown aside. There you have then fights against the odds, and as we know, breathless defenses of forlorn hopes. That's very British. There's a lot of imperial iconography from the 19th century coming out of the Indian Mutiny and such like, about last man stands, this kind of stuff. You all know, what is it, the retreat from Kabul and the imagery of that. So this is all part of a wider iconographic trail of being British. And like the other films, individual acts are changing the course of history. So there, you get Corporal Jarvis of the Royal Engineers blowing up the bridge under heavy fire. So this is an amazing film. You can see the majority of this now if you go to the British Film Institute, go to the Rubin Library. You can watch it. It's a non-theatrical cut that they've got there. There's pretty much all of it, but it is a non-theatrical version. One of these days, I suppose, if they ever got the cash to spare, they will drag the very, very dangerous and degraded stuff, out of its original tins, and they might be able to digitize it. But for those of you who have seen the Great War series, the early episode where they're showing Mons and the retreat. There are tons of scenes taken from this film that are used, you know, as documentary sources. And what's also brilliant about this film is historiographically, there is a nice settling of old scores. The great Sir Horace is invited to play a role, and of course, as this goes into production in the spring of 1926, you know, just a year earlier, in May 1925, just as Ypres was at its height, actually, Sir John French had died. So with French out of the way, Sir Horace gets his moment, doesn't he? He appears. So there he is on his horse, reviewing the men, you know, knackered, coming back on the retreat. And of course, what the film then does is show that he is right to stand and fight his rearguard action. It sets a new standard in history. You know, the great war hero Johnny French, you can do this now because he's died a year earlier, and a different version can come out, and it's clear that Horace wants to get back on his horse and put his uniform on, you know, because this is going to vindicate his decision, the decision to fight at Le Cateau. So there is a sort of fascinating historiographical battle going on here. Now, they've made you know, considering what they cost to make, and considering how much help they're getting from the War Office to make these, you know, they're making a good, pretty penny of profit. And, you know, you've got to give it to Wolfe. He says, right, we're going to make a real biggie now. We are going to go back to the Navy, and we're going to do the epic. We're going to do the battles of Coronel and Falkland Islands. And we're not going to do this with models. Oh, no. We are going to get the Mediterranean fleet to put to sea from Valletta for us. And we will do it just before they start their summer manoeuvres and exercises, and we will film it. And the Admiralty says, yeah, all right, fine, go for it. So, you know, the scale of the production is quite immense, and you can see the way British instructional films, you know, through this have gone on a commercial catapult, because now the press is interested in everything they do, you know, and you get all the things that you would associate with you know, the modern movie industry. So that the press is following the production as it's in place. So there you can see they actually take over, they build a new studio in, of all places, Swiss Cottage, for the interior scenes, where they build a massive tank in which they're going to float these huge models. You can see there on the left, and there you can see on the right in the Daily Mirror this cradle that they built for a tracking shot, this incredible tracking shot along a dinner which is given for von Spee by the German community at Valparaiso when he comes in victorious after Coronel. And the prestige of the production, you know, once it's finished, very deliberately, I think that they move. For the first time, BIF doesn't have its premiere at the Marble Arch Pavilion. It goes to the New Gallery Cinema in Lower Regent Street, very close to where the Paris studios now, you know, became for the BBC. And I think that's a deliberate choice, the New Gallery Cinema, because it's home to the private film clubs. So it's regarded, you know, as the place almost, you know, for like avant-garde cinema. Remember, in the 1920s, you can't see Soviet cinema. It's still censored in Britain. So you can't see the Eisenstein classics. You can only do that at a private screening, and this is where they're all shown. So you have to join the various private cinema clubs to get a chance to see it. And the new gallery is where the biggest of those sort of productions are shown. So I think that they're showing there, you know, that this is also a work of art. This is a major piece of you know, international cinema making, and it's going to have, though, your usual hallmarks. You know, we are going to show you, just like all the other films that we've made, where the War Office has been a collaborator, that we have the cooperation of the British Admiralty, you know, the Navy League, and an advisory committee. And this is what means it is not like a Hollywood melodrama, because we are led by the history. And of course, if it's the British Admiralty that's telling you it's authentic, it is authentic, right? And that's the end. There are no arguments, right? If the British Admiralty says it's right, it is right. But in this amazing film, you know, and I think then what's makes it such a fascinating watch is the only official cast list that you get for the film is the list of the ships. So the ships become the stars, really, you know, and the men are, the sailors are kind of the ghosts in the naval machine, as it were, that make it work. So that is the only cast list you get. Now, what is it made up of? Well, thanks to being done on this scale, you know, you do get adventure and thrills. You know, you get dreadnought turrets rotating, you get firing of guns. And this is, you know, where we can bring in the thing about silent cinema never ever being silent. This one has a full original score written to accompany it. The big cinemas, especially something like the New Gallery Cinema, has a complete special effects team. So behind the scenes, you know, when it is stoking scenes, they have got an enormous pile of coal, and they've got guys chucking coal around backstage to replicate that. They've got chains, they've got they've got bangers, they've got explosives. So anytime something happens, you know, there is a full sonic effect here. You've not just got the music, you've got sound effects, and big cinemas have that. Incidentally, a South London cinema, during the screening of Mons, the special effects manager went so overboard that the police came in to work out what was going on, because they thought there was a bank robbery going on somewhere. They thought there was an armed robbery going on. I mean, that's how much noise was being made. So yeah, these must have been, you know, quite something to see in the cinema. Where I think you can see the 1920s grinding on, and how this film is almost in some ways like a cinematic version of Locarno, is that there is great gallantry shown from both sides. For the first time ever, we really get depictions of Germans and German sailors here. And they are seen to be men suffering, who show heroics, who suffer the agonies of war, and respect their fellow, their foe, you know, as a worthy foe, that there is mutual respect shown between the protagonists in Coronel and Falkland Islands. And certainly von Spee himself, you know, all the way through, is a very worthy enemy who respects British naval traditions, you know, and knows what to expect from the British Navy. And again, to get this sense of authenticity, what I found absolutely fascinating, von Spee and his officers are played by German actors. It's a film with no spoken dialogue. Why do you need a German actor? But it is thought that in order, you know, to get the psyche, to get the gestures right, for the look to be right, you simply have to have German actors. So some pretty famous German names are brought in to play the roles in the battles of Coronel and Falkland Islands. So successful at doing this is it that it gets a full release in Germany. At the first in the summer of 1928, at the Ufa Pavilion is held the first convention of European filmmakers. And the film that's chosen as the British entry to be shown at the Ufa Pavilion is Coronel and Falkland Islands, and it goes down a storm. German audiences love it. And I think it is, because of that element of mutual respect being shown there. So, an unexpected surprise. What we also get in this film, which I find fascinating, you get a little bit of this in Mons, is the role of civilians. We also get into it, and that civilians did play their part in war. So there's Mrs. Felton of Port Pleasant, who spots the German fleet and tells Government House in Stanley what she's seen. Now, interestingly, they do some location film for the Falkland Islands, but they do not go to the Falkland Islands. Oh, no. They go to the Scilly Isles. So the locals play the Falkland Islands Defence Force. So there you go. You've got virtually the whole of St Mary's, turning out because they all want to get on the film. Incidentally, the governor of the Falkland Island goes absolutely crazy. He said, "Why didn't you come down here and film?" Doesn't seem to sort of build in the logistics of going 8,000 miles to get about 15 minutes worth of film. We're not really going to do that. But he's absolutely apoplectic. And he also doesn't like the fact that Summers does his sort of usual bit here, because he's trying to interject a little bit of lightheartedness. You've got like the big opening scene of Coronel and the drama of that, and you've got Falkland Islands to come. So he plays the scenes on the Falkland Islands for comedy. I mean, they almost feel like Dad's Army, the Dad's Army series made 30 odd years too early. So the Falkland Islands Defence Force, there's lots of saluting in the wrong order, lots of coming to attention like Private Jones, and it's all played for knockabout comedy. And the governor of the Falkland Islands is apoplectic. How dare you? These men are incredible shots. They're very well trained. They're very patriotic. You're making a laughing stock of us. So he doesn't really get it. Falkland Islanders themselves, when it was finally shown in Stanley, seemed to have got the joke. They went along with it. I think that the governor was more upset on their behalf than they genuinely felt themselves. So there you go. There are the guys going off. Now, this film does well at the box office, but not as well as Ypres and Mons and some of the others. Why might we say that is? Well, on the one hand, by the end of the 20s, there have been a lot of war films. There's been a lot of them. So I think we can put that into it, that perhaps they're past their peak a little bit at this stage. Also, and dare I say it, you might even suggest that people were less interested in a film that was completely even-handed, that perhaps they liked the straightforward good guys, bad guys routines of some of the earlier films. But as I said, don't sort of run away with the idea that it's a financial disaster. It isn't, and indeed, they've still got the appetite for making war films, because the next one they decide to do, they're going to sort of break out of the what has been the usual mold. Wolf buys the rights to the best, to Ernest Raymond's best-selling novel, Tell England. So there's going to be a Gallipoli film now. 1928, they announce they're going to make Tell England. And there's a huge launch for this, and they have a dinner in which they serve, chocolate. They have Chocolate Hill pudding, and it's like really weird course names. They have like Philly Daniel de Anzac Bay, and it goes to prove you can get away with these things. It's really, really odd. That's how they launch it. Now, I don't know if you've seen Tell England. The problem with it is one of those films of which there is a good few dozen that is caught right on the production cusp. They are about a third of the way through production when sound comes in. And like all of those studios, you know, which have spent money and have got a film rolling, they've got a film in production, what the hell do you do now? Is there ever going to be an audience for a silent film? So production is stopped because they decide it's got to go to sound. They've got the new young rising star of British cinema, Anthony Asquith, in, supported by the war veteran Geoffrey Barkas, who's helping him. And this is really where the film collapses in many ways. If you've seen Tell England, you can see that it's a silent film that has had sound wedged onto it. And artistically, you know, and in narrative terms, it doesn't work. The pace of it doesn't work. It doesn't quite come together. And of course, American audiences do not get it at all. What's it? Variety says, Tell England, I really wish they could tell someone else, you know, because they don't get the accents, these cut glass English accents, they can't understand. They need subtitles, they want intertitles, they do not get it. But visually, you know, particularly the landing sequences, oh my goodness, you know, nothing touches them until Saving Private Ryan. Nothing comes close to them. They go to Malta, to St. Paul's Bay. So once again, the Mediterranean fleet is called upon. So there's the Queen Elizabeth coming out with the lighters. And you can see from the quality of these production stills, you know, the cinematography is truly amazing. There is going, that's St. Paul's Bay, Malta. They're going in, you know, for the landing. They almost managed to buy the River Clyde. They couldn't quite, but they were going to, after the production, they were going to put it on the Thames and have it as a museum to help, you know, recoup some of the production costs, but they couldn't get hold of it in the end. And they bought a ship that was very, very similar, which was on, by that stage, on the Italian, it was on the Brindisi Mail Run. So that plays the River Clyde. And there you can see there, look, see the production team in the water shooting. So they're about to land. There you can see the explosions, and then this incredible point of view shot from the Turkish defenders as they are gunning the men down. You know, and the sea runs with blood. It is horrifying. It is spectacular. It's just a pity the rest of the film, you know, doesn't quite live up to this 20-odd minute sequence, you know, and there it goes, and there are the guys, you know, storming up the bluffs. So you know, this film is also obviously, of course, coming out in the same mix as All Quiet on the Western Front, and thanks to the sort of true internationalism of All Quiet on the Western Front, doesn't do quite as well. But again, it's been sort of too easily kind of brutalized, because as I say, it's got some, you know, in some of the responses to it, because it's been written off yet again as an upper class and kind of stiff upper lip British classic that makes no sense to anybody that wasn't from Eton and sort of alive in 1931. So I think if you look at those landing sequences closely, you know, and see the genius of them, you get to see the true heart of the film. It does very well in the Irish Free State because of the resonances of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, just as Ypres had done very well in the Irish Free State. It does so well in the Irish Free State that the IRA tries to blow up cinemas showing it. They try to disrupt a screening in Dublin, which goes hideously wrong for them, because there's a cohort of veterans from the Royal Dublin Fusiliers out, and they beat these IRA lads to a pulp. The police get in just in the nick of time, pretty much to save them. And, you know, and they're dragging them off, and they are saving these guys' lives because the veterans are not having this. Anyway, let's get back to this. So there we are. You know, 1931 is the last of these films. This is the end of the line for British instructional films in many ways, because of the capitalization that they'd had to win, the liquid capital they'd had to find to make this film as a sound production, ruined their sound finances, and they end up being balled up and they move into a bigger conglomerate of British international pictures. But Somers goes on to make some excellent films in the 1930s. So this is the end of the battle reconstruction films. But as I hope I've sort of shown you tonight, they are fascinating, complex bits of work which tell us so much about the way the war was conceived of and remembered in the 1920s. And on that, thank you all for listening. I will shut up.
Thanks, Mark. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. Some amazing shots there that I'd never seen before. There's a question came in on social media. I'll just read that one out while I start to bring one or two questions up. He asked, did other countries create similar films in the 20s?
Yes, so particularly Hollywood. You've got particularly films like Big Parade, and if you've seen, Wings is fantastic. The aviation film. There's Hell's Angels, another William Wyman aviation film. The Germans make a lot, particularly quite a few naval epics. They make a great film about the Emden, and then there's an Australian version of the Emden where they splice in bits actually from the original German production. The French produce quite a lot. There is a fantastic film about Verdun. It's about, you have to have a long Sunday afternoon. It's about 4 hours long in about three sort of major chunks, and that's an amazing one. And of course, you have Abel Gance's J'accuse, where the ghosts of the dead come out of their graves at Verdun, and they go back home, and they find a society that seems to have forgotten them all, and sort of dead men look through the windows of their houses, and they see like their wives have married again, and they want to know what's gone on. There are some remarkable war films out there made in the 20s, and all the competent nations are putting them out.
Okay. Brett, would you like to ask a question?
Thanks. I have a particular interest in the Battle of Loos. Mm-hmm. Because a friend of mine's father, was wounded and taken prisoner in the Battle of Loos. Mm-hmm. Now, I live in Thurrock.
Right.
Thurrock was made a film called The Guns of Loos, which featured Piper Laidlaw.
Absolutely.
Who won his VC at Battle of Loos.
Yeah.
Now, I've heard of the film.
Yeah.
Someone said a long time ago that he still exists, but I've never seen a copy of it.
Yeah, you can see it at the British Film Institute. If you go to the Rubin Library of the British Film Institute, and you can book into there. They've got like these video screens, and you can book a slot and you can watch it. It's been digitized.
Oh, but you can't do it online. You have to go.
No, you've got to go to the South Bank.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great film. It's really fantastic.
Thanks.
It's great melodrama.
David, do you want to ask us?
How much would it cost to restore the film of Mons?
Oh gosh, you'd have to ask the BFI. That's way beyond me. I mean, I was lucky. I was really lucky. This is a slight tangent. Just as I was writing the book, they were working on the digital remastering of Coronel and Falkland Islands. You can get that on DVD, and that's how I ended up writing some of the liner notes of the booklet that goes with it. I know that cost a pretty penny and required quite a lot of different sponsors to get it done. Now, by the same token, as we know about all of these techniques, they are becoming cheaper and cheaper the whole time because they're being the processes are being refined, and the scale of that kind of work is increasing. I think the best thing to do is to drop the silent movie team at the BFI a line, because they know, because they're working on this, and they could let you know. But I'm really sorry, it's beyond me to the technicalities of that to know how much it would cost.
I was wondering whether the WFA could sponsor it in some way.
That they might want to be one of the sponsors, I'd say, because I think it's yeah, exactly. I think maybe get Visit Wallonia or something, or the Belgian Tourist Board involved, that they might want to put in a few quid, because yeah, I think it's serious cash to do that kind of thing.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, David. Hugh, good evening and welcome.
Thank you, and thank you, Mark, for a wonderful talk. I was going to ask a very similar question, or question about England. When you mentioned the digitization of the Falkland Islands, of course, the Navy then put money in again. I mean, they made a big thing of it, and the early were Royal Naval occasions, as they had a launch in probably at the BFI, didn't they? And
Did it in at National Film Theatre.
Right, absolutely. And then they did it in Glasgow, I think, too, with the Royal Marine Band and everything doing the. So in a way, it was a repeat, of course, of they behaved.
Yes.
But my question mark was about Tell England, because I've never seen it. It's a source of frustration to me. And presumably you can see it on the BFI, but is there any other format that is? No,
there are tiny bits on YouTube. Otherwise, no one's ever put it out on DVD. It's been shown on TV a handful of times. I think the last time was when Channel 4 was in its very early days, and had Leslie Halliwell as its director of films. And of course, he was, a genius at all that kind of stuff, wasn't he? I think that was the last time it was on any kind of, usual broadcasting. Otherwise, it is a case of booking in at the Rubin Library to see it. And as said, it's uneven. I think is the best way of describing it, but those landing sequences are worth it. Yeah, they're so powerful.
Do you know why? I mean, Tell England is a very odd novel indeed.
Yes.
And with all the sort of repressed homosexuality and all that in the film, it's an extraordinary choice at one level. If you make a film about Gallipoli, you think you might have gone for something else as the basis, and you don't know why they chose.
No, I'm wondering if it's got anything to do with the fact that in 1926, when they're most flush with cash, actually, and that they're deciding that they're going to go for bigger productions, they bring on board onto the board of directors John Buchan to start advising them. And I'm just wondering whether Buchan's kind of literary sense then pushes them in that direction, and they suddenly, he's suddenly the guy that's making them go outside, to pure kind of fiction narrative, but interwoven with historical fact. And they're also, in the early days of this project, talking to Ian Hamilton. And again, I wonder if Hamilton then says, well, there's this lovely book about it, and that might be the way to go. And then there's some fascinating stuff, in the Hamilton papers, because pretty much as soon as they tell him he can be in it a tiny bit and wear his uniform and have his sword, then he's all up for it. Oh, well, perhaps I can be part of it. And then he sort of changes his mind entirely. Yeah, so I think it's possibly to do with some of the outsiders, that are suddenly involved. And more particularly Buchan, it wouldn't surprise me if he's the one who thinks a novel is the way to go. And here's a bestseller. So let's snap up, the literary rights or the film rights to that.
Okay, thank you for joining us, Hugh. Gordon, welcome.
Thank you, Simon. Smashing that, Mark. I thoroughly enjoyed it. My question is mainly about the nuts and bolts of these films. Were these films made up from the stills and film sort of interspersed and into the production of the production on the stage sets? Were they all pushed in like that?
No, I mean, apart from those very, apart from Armageddon, which we can only work out from the reviews and the written descriptions of it, that clearly used some stills, and as I say, it used some newsreel footage, but then had pretty extensive reconstructed scenes, particularly this Fall of Jerusalem sequence with the guys from the London Territorials, coming up and arranging for keys to be handed over and such like. But after that, it's all it's all filmed live action. The odd model sequence, like in Zeebrugge, that the boats are all clearly models. And incidentally, it's the guys from Standard Fireworks come in to do all that. They like all these explosions. So you then, the only time that you really get any stills, as I say, is when they have these occasional map shots and things like that, and it's often a map that, in fact, when you drill into them, they mostly, to me, look like they're using ones from the Times history of the war. But that's the only time you get anything like that. Otherwise, it's complete reconstruction of scenes.
So none of the World War I filmmakers or photographers really got involved or on board with any of it? No. As I said, I think probably having two veterans so crucial to it in Water Summer and H.B. Wolfe, they probably felt that they had enough authenticity, and they could, and Summers clearly wanted to create his own cinematic images. Yes. Okay, thanks for that.
Not a problem.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. Andrew, it took me a couple of goes to get you up. Want to go next?
Thanks, Simon. That was a fantastic presentation, Mark. I really enjoyed it. I must confess a special interest. I'm actually writing my MA dissertation on the Great War in popular cinema, and your book is very well kind of tagged for that. I think the book, your book and Lawrence's book on cinema in the 1920s has been absolutely game changing in terms of us re-evaluating the films of the 1920s. And I think for anybody who's not seen them, you can hire Mons and look at, and I watched Tell England in the Mediatek. So you sit in a booth and put in headphones on and watch the film, and it's an incredible. But they're all incredible films, and if you look past the sort of shakiness of them, and then the sort of naive is something that was a real eye opener for me. And as part of my studies, I've watched pretty much everything from the Battle of the Somme, Malin's documentary in 1916 to the War Below, and I think the films of the 1920s absolutely stand up. Yeah, absolutely stand up. My question really is, and something that I've come to believe really strongly is that the films of the 1920s that were made actually represent closer to the experience that was related by veterans and experienced by veterans than we've seen in the more kind of gross caricatures that have characterized particularly officer-man relationships that I know Gary Sheffield's written about. And if you look at, say, for example, like the Jonathan Ryan Tuck officer character in The Trench, it's a gross caricature and doesn't reflect what I think the memoirs talk about, the real relationship. Do you think the films of BIF and the other ones of the 20s have that kind of authenticity that, if you like, revisionist historians really adhere to now, and they actually stand up as more reflective of what the real experience was of the war?
Yes, but largely because veterans are such an enormous part of the production process. I think they are bringing that. What I should have said about Mons is, by that stage, quite a lot of the extras in Mons were ex-servicemen. They asked them to come and play a role, and of course, where there's this sort of beautiful circularity. If you think, as we all know, that so many of the soldiers in 1914 would have been reservists anyway. So say, a veteran would reach the front in 1917. By 1926, he's about the age that a reservist in 1914, would have been. So that it kind of ends up with those beautiful sort of reality and art coming together in a nice little synergy there. But and I also think the sheer fact that the British Legion, the old comrades associations, go as groups to see it, that veterans often get up on stage, before a film, that these films start, and will address the audience. They've clearly seen it, and the part of the shtick is, that you're getting the audience ready for it. The fact that there is so much veteran validation of these films, I think, gives it. We can say that they take it as an authentic interpretation. That they want to be associated with them, and do not write them off. And so yes, I think there is very definitely that connection between the veterans and what they're seeing there, that we can give them, as you say, give them credit for being remarkable interpretations of the real thing, given what you could get away with at the time. And we do have to remember, there are too many broken-hearted widows out there for you to show guts on the floor. You can't do that. You can't show, even if the censorship rules of the time would have allowed it, you can't show a head rolling along, or someone absolutely covered in blood because someone's been blown up next to them. You can't do that because the wounds of grief are too real for too many people. But once you're within that constraint, you are, I think, seeing something quite remarkable.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you very much. David Jones, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Simon. Thank you, Mark, for that really, really good presentation. Really enjoyable. I suppose as a retired history teacher, you're often looking at how has war in its different guises contributed in one way or another to maybe improving life and the quality of life. Obviously like medicine, for example. Mm-hmm. In this particular sense, when you actually look at cinematography pre-First World War or early First World War, particularly in America, you see particular techniques being developed, which are really fairly sort of simplistic in their methodology. So therefore, looking at the way in which the films that were made after the First World War, do you feel that the directors, the producers, the set designers actually were setting a whole new standard and of techniques and style and storytelling, so that obviously the British film industry and certainly Hollywood then looked at these techniques that were being developed post First World War, and then thought, hey, these are good ideas, we can use them in making our films as well. What do you think about that, Mark?
I mean, I think to me, the most fascinating thing is Coronel and Falkland Islands, because there is no evidence whatsoever that Walter Summers had seen any of Eisenstein's films, right? There is a sequence in Portsmouth Harbour when they're making Inflexible and Invincible ready to be raced down to the South Atlantic, which is montage and is cross-cutting, which is absolutely remarkable. It's Eisenstein to a T, and yet there is no evidence that Summers had ever seen any of the Soviet classics. So clearly his sort of cinematic mind is whirring away here, and is produced. I mean, in cinematic terms, that is the highlight of the movie, actually, is the making ready of the ships. It has elements of Fritz Lang. There is Metropolis going on visually in that sequence. It is truly remarkable. On a more pedestrian level, he does some very clever things in Mons. Every time there is a retreat of British forces in Mons, they come towards the camera and then move to the audience's right. They move that way, downwards, downstage. And I kept thinking, why is it? Why are they always moving the same way? And of course, once you start thinking about it in terms of the bird's eye view of the map, it's reinforcing the fact that the whole time in 1914, the British Army was moving away from Britain. It was moving deeper into France. It was leaving the viewer. It was leaving the home front. It was leaving you, the audience, behind. It was fighting a battle and you were getting detached from them. And so just little repeated techniques like that, I find remarkable. So yeah, in the 1920s, the cinematic art, and the art of the high silent period, anyone who's seen a Rudolph Valentino movie, will know that they are fantastic works of art. And also, if I come back to Coronel and Falkland Islands, if you look how many intertitles there are, if you count them, I mean, it's a miracle I'm still married, isn't it? I counted the intertitles in these films. And the more regularly you have to use an intertitle is clearly because the director doesn't think that, the visuals are hammering it. The audience, needs the prompt. By the time you get to Coronel and Falkland Islands, Summers is using them so sparingly because his visuals are telling it for him. You know what's going on. You can work it out. You don't need much. And again, that's why I think it is a wonder of silent cinematic art. I mean, as just as a kind of aside, on the other extreme, of course, in Weimar cinema, because they didn't have as much money as Hollywood, what they are doing is making a hyper reality, aren't they, of what they've going, and I mean it's for a completely different day. But if you've seen Nosferatu, what an amazing film that is, and it's just remarkable, isn't it? Given the budget that they had and the way, in fact, that they make the budget and the limitations work for them. They make a virtue out of it artistically. That makes that a remarkable film. Yeah, so I think the 20s are much underrated, and because everyone,
totally.
Yeah, and I think everybody somehow thinks that a silent film must be quite dull. No, far from it. That they are spectacular and they will hold your attention from first to last. The best of them will easily do that.
Thank you very much for the very detailed answer. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David. Peter, you've been waiting a while. Would you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Nosferatu still scares me, to be honest.
Oh, terrifying.
Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is another one. Just one other point before I ask my question. You mentioned that you thought Tell England wasn't available on YouTube except in part.
Yeah,
it's actually available in full.
Oh, it is now, right? Okay.
If it's an hour and 54 minutes long, anyway. It's
okay. Oh, that's great. I hadn't realised that it was there.
Yeah. Okay. The question I wanted to ask really is sort of response to something you said about a third of the way through, I think, which is around why the films were popular almost despite people's reaction to the horrors of the war itself. I mean, I had always thought, and perhaps been taught, I may be wrong in this, that the Roaring Twenties and all of that involved, the Jazz Age and sort of Flappers and the Charleston and all of that, was essentially in response to those horrors and an attempt by particularly younger people to forget. Whereas what you're saying is that there was a willingness to actually rediscover or revisit what the war was actually about. So can we explore that a little bit? Have you got any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly the forgetting, if it is happening, is being done by a relatively small section of society, which dominates some of the cultural expressions as well, or certainly in retrospect, have been given the status. But, if you think of an absolute jazz age writer like F. Scott Fitzgerald, and the remarkable writing. As we know, The Great Gatsby is all about the war, isn't it? I mean, who the way Gatsby has invented himself on the Western Front, that he's an Oxford man and an officer, and who knows really what he is or where he's come from, but the war gives him his status and in his mystique. We know in Tender is the Night, don't we, that scene, which is clearly at Beaumont Hamel, isn't it? It's in the Newfoundland Memorial Park, where they're standing there trying to take in what has happened. So there, in the heart of two of the great jazz age novels, we have the war, and you just cannot escape it. And I think if you then go into the lower layers, shall we say, of popular culture and melodrama, of course that the war's there the whole time. Whenever I say to my students, who is one of the single best-selling authors in Britain in the 1920s and 1930s, and very few of them, probably quite rightly, have ever heard of Sapper McNeill. So if you read, I get them to read Bulldog Drummond stories. Read Bulldog Drummond, all about the war, all about the fact that foreigners are intrinsically dodgy. There's a good splash of British xenophobia there, and most of the dodgiest foreigners are either communist or Germans. So there's still Harry Hunn out there that you need to keep an eye on, and so once you get down into that kind of pulp literature, the kind of the proverbial chap or chapess on the Clapham Omnibus is reading, you're seeing the war again and again and again, and I think in retrospect, at the end, of what we wrongly kind of consider, because it's an imposition on it, as the interwar years. I don't know if you've ever read or seen a production or seen David Lean's wonderful film adaptation of Noel Coward's This Happy Breed. What an amazing play that is. Coward, a man who sort of broke down really in training, officer training, and unfortunately was never dispatched, never got to him. But he clearly, by mixing with people like Scott Moncrief, clearly understood the mind of the officer and what all of this meant. And those two main characters in that play, Bob Mitchell and Frank Gibbons, the voice that he brings to them, where they're always going on about the war. There's that lovely line, isn't there, that one of the daughter's friend says, was it Mr. Gibbons and Mr. Mitchell were in the war together, weren't they? Yes, and to hear those two speak, you'd think they're the only ones that ever were. Because that's all they do. They nag on about it the whole time. So there was sort of Coward bringing it out into a piece of sort of middle brow.
Was that written in the 20s, Mark?
That was actually written in 1938, so it's right at the end of the era, right at the end. But yeah, I mean, if you delve through popular literature of the 20s, Pass Garde Ypres by Willier, by Ronald Gurner, Behind the Lines, Philip MacDonald, before he goes off to Hollywood to become a screenplay writer, his novella The Lost Patrol, about the guys caught in the desert in Mesopotamia. They get holed up at an oasis and Arabs are attacking them. There are adventure stories, there are romances, there are melodramas. It's just that you have to sort of delve around in secondhand bookshops to pick them up these days, and work out what it is. R.H. Mottram, which very few people read these days, but best-selling stuff. And of course, the Spanish Farm trilogy was turned into a film. The Roses of Picardy, and there is Mademoiselle from Armentières as well. So it's everywhere. It really is. So that was a very long-winded response, but it is everywhere. You do not escape it.
Absolutely delighted to be so thoroughly re-educated. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Thank you. David, you've been very patient. Last question of the evening, so go for it.
Thank you very much, Mark. My question relates a bit to Andrew Moody's points. And you implied that Tell England was, in effect, the last of this genre. But as I recall, there was a film made after World War II about the Battle of Arnhem that used quite a few veterans from the
absolutely.
Some very wooden dialogue. But
Theirs is the Glory. Theirs is the Glory by Brian Desmond Hurst. Yeah.
Were there any more?
What I meant was the end of the road for British instructional films. Right, because of course, in 1940, when the GPOs, incredible film unit, which had been Night Mail and all the rest of them, when that is rebadged as the Crown Film Unit, it reinvigorates, and creates this whole new approach, which is known as the drama documentary. So, you get Target for Tonight, you get Western approaches, you get Fires Were Started. So you get a brilliant run. And as you say, in 1945, just soon after the end of the war, Brian Desmond Hurst goes out and makes his homage to the men of the airborne division at Arnhem, and he gets the old lags back to play their roles. Yeah, absolutely. So it does not it doesn't die. I say it just was the end of the road for them as a production company.
Thank you very much. I have a bit of an interest in Arnhem because I lived there for 6 months when I was a student.
Wow,
doing work experience just near the bridge.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to the end. Mark, stunning, and some great conversations there in the Q&A session. So if I could ask people to give one last round of applause to Mark for another great talk. I'm struggling to think what we'll have you back for next time, but I'm sure we'll think of something. So that's it for tonight. Just remains for me to say thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you, Mark, again. And I'll drop you an email tomorrow, just points of detail, and just another plug for the book. You've enjoyed the talk. It's all in here in the book, in Mark's book. But thoroughly enjoyable. So thanks a lot, Mark, and thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
And goodbye to good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on Kick Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on Kick Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on Kick Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get on.